had stopped at last, leaving the street a glistening black groove of shiny asphalt that rippled and quivered under the dim street lamps in the keen wind, as though it were a snake come alive. It was a queer sort of street anyway, as it seemed to force itself into this musty neighborhood, writhing by the mouldering old flats and decrepit buildings of a departed era, and finally winding up in a baffled dead end overlooking the oily and ugly waters of the East River. There was a 3-story house near the end of this sinister street, an old brick and sandstone affair which can best be described as a house with a bad odor. A sign of tarnished and half-obliterated gold letters creaked dismally in the wind above the worn steps of the stoop. It read, "Kirsov's Private Museum." But the old building was not as dilapidated within as it appeared from without. There were well-made locks on the strong doors and serviceable shutters for the windows. Ivan Kirsov took no chances where it concerned his antiques and art treasures. He stood now just within the door, peering out like a gnome at the deserted street. Kirsov was a short and rotund little man with a stubby grey beard and a pate as shiny and barren as the thoroughfare at which he looked. His eyes were a moist and watery brown, his nose bulbous, his teeth yellow and stained. Clothes always hung and draped themselves clumsily on his chubby body. On the hat rack in the corner was the kind of faded green fedora one might associate with an impoverished poet or threadbare philosopher. Certainly not with a museum owner. Yet Kirsov was neither poet nor philosopher. He was a dealer in curios and antiques. Collectors had implicit faith in his integrity and paid exorbitant prices for his curios and objets d'art. Nobody ever suspected that any of his pieces were fraudulent. His skillfully manufactured papyri delighted Egyptologists. Counterfeit scarabs, bogus manuscripts, and ancient cut glass imported from Bavaria were snapped up eagerly. In 15 years, Mr. Kirsov had amassed a tidy fortune by bamboozling a select public. However, Kirsov had not always been so opulent, so respected, so clever in his forgeries. There was one bitter pill in his ointment. Some 20 years ago, he had been caught red-handed in a swindle by a raw-boned young plainclothes cop. And Mr. Kirsov had spent 3 years up the river in meditation on the theorem that crime does not pay. That, of course, was in the days when he was slender and bore the name of Ralsinski. Now, nobody knew the antique dealer Kirsov as the swindling Ralsinski. But Kirsov remembered, with a bitterness that was almost appalling. He had never forgotten the young Irish policeman who had tripped him up by sheer luck, and Ivan Kirsov, deep in his heart, had vowed revenge. The years had not blunted his hatred, rather, they had intensified it. A man came along the quiet street, his dark topcoat buttoned up about his burly figure against the clutching fingers of the wind. Kirsov's face lighted up with an oily smile, and he quickly opened the door to admit this expected guest. "Come in, Inspector Pankhurst," he said heartily. "I was afraid the storm would detain you. Come right along to my private study where we can have a glass of wine while we talk." "Weather never stops policemen and postmen," chuckled Pankhurst, divesting himself of his damp overcoat. Ensconced in a big leather chair which had come from medieval Florence, all of Kirsov's furniture and furnishings in his private office were authentic. The big inspector smacked his lips appreciatively over the mellow wine and came to the point. "So you have an unusual object," he said. "A curio that you feel sure my brother will want to add to his collection." "Exactly, Inspector," agreed Kirsov earnestly. "Here, let me fill your glass again. Yes, Boyd Pankhurst will be crazy to add this object to his Egyptian collection. I wanted you to see it first." "I don't know much about this sort of stuff," Pankhurst grated. "I don't know why you didn't send for my brother instead of me." "Oh, I will, but I thought that you should see it." "All right, Kirsov, what is it?" The art dealer waited till the inspector had finished his second glass of wine. "The object is," he said slowly, "the mummy of Ptolemy IV." "Which means little to me," said Pankhurst drowsily. "It's warm and cozy in here after that raw wind. Yes, isn't it? About the mummy, Inspector. You see, the story connected with it goes back some time. 20 years, to be exact. The officer frowned. He was having difficulty correlating and focusing his thoughts. 20 years, Pancoast said. An Egyptian mummy ought to go back 20 centuries, oughtn't it? Quite so, but this is an unusual mummy, answered Kersov. His moist brown eyes seemed to flow clammily over the corpulent figure of his guest. In this case, the story begins 20 years ago, with a struggling Russian artisan who was trying to gain a foothold in this country. He was succeeding when a young pup of a copper luckily stumbled into a little deal which violated the silly laws of this country, and Ralsinski was sent to prison. You look much surprised, Inspector. Would you remember that far back to such an insignificant episode in the life of an Irish policeman? But of course not, so I'll tell you. I was Ralsinski. Queer, now that I think of it. That young cop's name was the same as yours. Pancoast. The police inspector uttered a gurgling cry and tried to struggle to his feet, but he was powerless to move. Every muscle in his body was paralyzed. It is the wine, sighed Kersov wearily. Don't alarm yourself, my friend, or try to fight it. There is no use. It won't kill you for an hour, and meanwhile there is no known antidote for it. So just relax and listen. I want you to understand my little joke. The poisoned inspector's bulging eyes traveled to his wineglass and then back to the smirking, snarling face of his host. Only his eyes lived. Otherwise, he was utterly helpless. I was not tricking you, Inspector, Kersov went on, gloating, his voice edged with a passion and venom as he talked. I am really going to sell your brother that mummy, but how silly to offer the mummy of a Ptolemy. Just between you and me, I haven't a genuine one. But I can make a splendid imitation. After 20 years of hard work, I have learned to duplicate a great many things. And I discovered and perfected a new liquid chemical that tans and grays and desiccates a body until it mummifies beautifully. He paused and went on. I'm sorry we do not have the time for me to demonstrate it to you because you won't live long enough. However, I want you to know that you are to be the mummy of Ptolemy. I shall sell your body to your brother next week. Ironic and poetic, don't you think? Also, I shall be able to dispose of all evidence of murder at the same time. The blood-suffused face of the police inspector almost quivered in his terrific attempt to burst the invisible bonds which chained him. He did succeed in unlocking his jaw the slightest bit. You, he gasped hoarsely, expelling the last vestige of air from his lungs. And then his eyes set, and he went completely rigid, staring glassily at his enemy. Kersov smiled to himself. He drew forth a handkerchief and mopped his perspiring brow. It had been an ordeal at that. He arose, stepped over to his victim, and passed his pudgy hand across the man's face. Inspector Pancoast did not even blink. He felt for the pulse. It had stopped. Mike Pancoast was as dead as he would ever be. Breathing easier now, Kersov set to work. Puffing and panting, he lifted his victim by the shoulders and then dragged him out of the office and along the first floor of the gloomy old museum to the stairs leading to the basement. Down these he tumbled the body. Then he removed his coat and followed. Stripping Pancoast of his clothes, Kersov burned everything in the furnace. He clipped and shaved the head of the corpse and then pried open the jaws with a steel tool and critically examined the teeth. Finding 3 which showed signs of modern dentistry, he took a hammer and a small chisel and knocked them out. Then he studied the profile of the rigid face and methodically used the hammer to smash the nose. All these preparations done with, he opened a large old-fashioned safe in his workroom and took out a stone crock of vile-smelling, almost viscous grey liquid. With a paintbrush, he began painting the corpse with the fluid. Several times as the devastating liquid instantly started pulling the skin dry and tight over the bones, the dead detective's legs or arms twitched in a cadaveric spasm. Kirsov wanted to scream and run from the house, but biting his lip in sadistic determination, he forced himself to complete his gruesome task. And at last, it was done. The body was visibly shrinking and turning a dull dun color. Within an hour, it looked as though it had slept for centuries in an ancient crypt in Egypt. Now came the artistic part. Kirsov carefully wrapped the body in yards and yards of grave cloth he had taken beforehand from a worthless but genuine mummy. He added redolent spices and the debris from the mummy he had previously unwrapped, and then placed his new creation within an ornate sarcophagus which stood ready. Ptolemy IV was all ready. All Kirsov had to do now was wait a few days for his mummy to age. Cleaning up everything carefully, burning all odds and ends in the furnace, Kirsov placed the lid on the sarcophagus and went upstairs. He started violently and shivered as he thought he heard a hoarse, gurgling voice saying, You. Ridiculous, he knew. But he scurried up to the first floor like a frightened rabbit, locking the basement stair door behind him with trembling hands. He didn't sleep any that night. In fact, there wasn't any night left. The first pale grey of a haggard dawn greeted him as he climbed to his living quarters on the third floor. But he was happy. After 20 years, he had consummated a clever and diabolical revenge. It was 5 days before Kirsov dared contact Boyd Pancoast. During the interim, he watched the newspapers for information about the missing Inspector Michael Pancoast. There was only one brief item that stated the inspector seemed to have left town for a few days. It was a disappointment, but such was fame. Pancoast wasn't even missed, not even by his brother. On the 5th day, Boyd Pancoast came at Kirsov's request to view his mummy. Kirsov had prepared carefully for this occasion. He had taken 2 of his hired attendants to bring up the sarcophagus from the basement and place it upright against the wall, in the midst of the Egyptian relics in the left wing. It made an effective-looking museum piece, but Ivan Kirsov wasn't as happy as he had been. Like a miasmic fog, an unseen but distinctly felt cloud had been slowly gathering about this weird old building on this dispirited, snaky street. The days weren't so bad, there was the help around, but at night, Kirsov was alone with all these relics of the moldering past and the grave. He felt that a ghastly familiar, growing stronger day by day, was dogging his footsteps wherever he went. That was ridiculous, of course. Many a man had been killed in thousands of ways, and nothing like this ever happened. But Kirsov couldn't shake off this unseen shadow, which settled more closely about him and seemed to strangle him a little more each day. Kirsov hadn't removed the lid of the sarcophagus since the night he had placed it on the mummy case. This morning, as he waited for the arrival of Boyd Pancoast, he dismissed his helpers and removed the lid himself. He screamed, trembled like a sapling in a high wind, almost letting the lid crash to the floor. The shaven-headed and grey, battered features of Inspector Pancoast, altogether unrecognizable now, were twisted in a hideous, leering grin, as though Pancoast knew a secret Kirsov didn't. It was too late to try to change the features. They were set in a mask like iron. An indefinable fetid odor emanated from the case. "By the sacred icon of St. Peter," whispered Kirsov, "I'll be glad to get rid of this thing quickly." And a ghostly echo seemed to burst into being within his brain, like a bursting star shell expands in the sky. You. The arrival of the Egyptologist brought Kirsov out of his jitters. The big man, older and grayer, but an unpleasantly close counterpart of his dead brother, examined the mummy carefully. Kirsov regained his composure and rattled off his prepared story about how this mummy came into his possession. It was a good story, and the trappings were authentic. "All right," agreed Boyd Pancoast at length, sniffing as though he smelled something too. I will purchase this mummy. What do you ask for it?"
$3,000, said Kirsov, and it's a bargain at that price.
"There's no doubt that it is genuine," said the Egyptologist. "But isn't your price a little too high?"
"I didn't get the mummy for nothing, Mr. Pankhurst," replied Kirsov with dignity.
No, I suppose not. I never saw a mummy with such a facial expression before. Well, I'll take it. I'll write you a check and I'll send a moving van to pick up the sarcophagus the first thing in the morning. I'll come myself just to take care of things, you know."
"Of course,"
agreed Kirsov craftily.
"But why don't you have your brother come, or send a couple of policemen to guard it?"
In the back of his mind, or was it loud in the middle of the chamber, there sounded the strangled words. You. But Boyd Pancoast was deaf to this. "I don't know where the inspector is," he admitted. "He's disappeared temporarily." Temporarily was good. Kirsov led the way to his office, smiling to himself. After the Egyptologist had departed, Kirsov began wishing he had taken his purchase with him. It gave him an eerie, ugly feeling to have the thing remain here another hour. And it was such a good joke. After a few more days of the inspector's temporary absence, the police and his brother would begin to get frantic. Kirsov could imagine the search. Boyd Pancoast would eventually offer a reward, of course. He was a wealthy man. The Bureau of Missing Persons would tie itself into knots. The rest of the police department would run around in circles. And all the time, the corpse of the frantically sought man would be grinning in a sarcophagus in the anxious Egyptologist's own private collection. What a perfect finale to a 20-year-old revenge. The only trouble was that nobody could enjoy the grim jest, save Kirsov and Mike Pancoast. And Mike Pancoast was dead. A sudden idea came to the demoniac little antique forger. Why not write the police an anonymous letter throwing suspicion on himself? He would like to see what they would do. It certainly would bring them running. But no, that was a foolish, dangerous thought. They might unearth and uncover his real identity as Ralsinski, and that might prove fatal. Instead, he must content himself with silent laughter. So he pulled the musty green fedora down over his bald head and trotted off to the bank to deposit Boyd Pancoast's check. The sky was overcast, lowering, when he returned home late in the afternoon. There wasn't much business. He did most of his transactions by appointments anyway. And he closed the museum early. A little before 6 o'clock, he had to start turning on lights all over the place. It grew dark with a positive vindictiveness that was almost personal. And turn on lights though he did, the electric bulb seemed to do little more than push the gloomy shadows back toward the corners of the various rooms where they seemed to lick their chops and slink in wait to leap out upon him. Fantastic! It was rubbish! But Ivan Kirsov felt stifled and terribly uneasy. After a lonely supper, which he prepared for himself, his frugality finally overcame his newly acquired reluctance toward the dark, and he slowly made his way downstairs to turn out the various lights. Such extravagance was idiotic. He avoided the left wing until last, slowly turning the first floor into an ocean of darkness, leaving only that last island of light to be flicked out just before he turned tail and scurried back to his quarters upstairs. Intensely disgusted with himself for such childish fears, he finally came to the wing of Egyptian curios and went about turning off the lights. As he was passing the alcove where the sarcophagus of the bogus Ptolemy IV leaned against the wall, he glanced furtively over his shoulder at the thing. With a start, he saw that he had forgotten to replace the lid, and the hideous, mutilated face of Inspector Pancoast leered straight at him. He gave vent to a little yelp of fear as he rested his hand on the light switch. "Curse you!" he snarled. "You'll be out of here before noon tomorrow, damn you! So grin all you like." He flipped down the switch, plunging the room into Stygian blackness. There was just a faint glow of light from the bulb out in the corridor. He whirled to run for the dubious safety of that wan refuge, when his eyes fell once more upon the Egyptian casket and his dead victim. And then Ivan Kirsov was too paralyzed to run. From the sarcophagus came that taintful effluvia of evil, a stifling odor which seemed to catch him around the throat and throttle him where he stood. But it wasn't this that caused his panic. A ghastly greenish glow emanated from the figure of the bogus Ptolemy, a visible aura which outlined the body perfectly. It was, good God, it was the spiritual entity, the Ka of Mike Pancoast. Kirsov nearly went mad with fright. "No!" he screamed aloud. "No, it isn't so! My reason knows better! I won't believe it! You're dead, do you understand? You're dead, and you'll stay dead! You can't harm anybody!" Drawn by his own rage and a deadly fascination, he crept slowly forward to confront the phosphorescent figure within the inclined mummy case. "Laugh!" he snarled. "Laugh from your place near the throne of Ptolemy. But I have the last laugh after all. $3,000 your brother paid me for you. $1,000 for each year you caused me to spend in the penitentiary. And..." He broke off in a strangled, gurgling scream as the vapor of the miasmic odor, or something quite as intangible, clamped down terrifically upon his throat. He fought against invisible bonds to escape, kicking and struggling madly, like a person in a nightmare who cannot escape inevitable doom, although unbound. In a few moments, even the sound of Kirsov's clawing and scratching nails upon the sides of the mummy case ceased, and silence, like that of the crypt, fell upon the dark chamber. It was broad daylight when the police found Ivan Kirsov. Summoned by the attendants who could not arouse their employer, the police smashed down the front door and entered. They were almost overcome by the evil smell from the left wing, and their subsequent discoveries were even more horrifying. Commissioner Enfield summoned matters up for Boyd Pancoast when he got the Egyptologist down to his office a couple of hours later. "It's horrible. Beyond words, Mr. Pancoast," he said. "The medical examiner had to perform his autopsy on the mummy with a hammer and chisel, but we found your brother. Kirsov had turned him into that mummy, somehow. You have the written report in your hand. Kirsov was stone dead when the squad got there, of course." Boyd Pancoast read through the report without a muscle of his face changing. Then he looked up. "The ways of Providence are very strange," he said gravely. "Embalming a human body in this fashion, Kirsov imprisoned all the gases and liquids within. No wonder there was a generation of gas in a sort of miasmic fog such as your men describe. I imagine Kirsov must have thought the ghost of Mike was after him, and he simply died of heart failure." "Yes," said the commissioner very gravely. "That's what's written in the report, for the record. Explains things satisfactorily, but it doesn't explain how the hands of the mummy came to be clamped around Kirsov's throat when he was found."
If you enjoyed this exhibit and you want to support the Mutant Museum, please consider donating, either on Ko-fi or as a regular Patreon supporter, like all of these amazing people, particularly Break System BSE, Michael Fattori, and Zachary Snowden-Smith. And you'll be able to see your own name up here on the very next video for as little as $1 a month. Please also do consider following me on Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd, as well as buying one or both of my ebooks. Links to all of these in the description. Thank you for being you. Yeah.